Thank you very much, and thank you for coming back after lunch. That's always pleasing to see. So this lecture explores how Christian ideas about the spirit, mind and body influenced medieval treatment of the sick. What does archaeological evidence reveal about therapeutic treatments in medieval monastic and hospital infirmaries? And what was the impact of monasticism on healthcare in Britain? The arrival of reformed monasticism in Scotland brought new ideas about health and the body. The ascetic tradition of Celtic monasticism placed great emphasis on disciplining the body and encouraged physical and social isolation, often in extreme landscape settings. Reformed monasteries lived communally, sharing daily liturgical routines in an enclosed space that was largely shut off from the world. The 6th century rule of St. Benedict provided the blueprint for monastic living, which was translated into real space in the St. Gall plan. The rule disciplined the body through celibacy, fasting, and daily and seasonal routines for prayer, work, talking, and sleeping. Everything was very strictly controlled. A special place was reserved in each community for the sick and elderly. Spiritual and physical health were regarded by medieval people as indivisible. The very existence of disease was attributed to original sin, and individual illnesses and disabilities were frequently understood as punishments for a bad life. Pain was regarded as cleansing the soul of sin and preparing the sinner for judgment after death. The Benedictine rule also emphasized the central role of hospitality and charity in monastic life, leading to the foundation of monastic almonaries and hospitals for the care of the poor and sick in medieval society. But I should stress that these were not hospitals in the modern sense of the word, providing medical intervention and emergency care. They're generally considered to have provided warmth, rest, basic nursing care, and nourishing food. Medieval hospitals were quasi-monastic institutions which often followed the Augustinian rule. They embodied Christian teachings on charity and offered welfare, although it was always welfare to the worthy and repentant poor. You had to be a good Christian. Hospitals were based around the concept of the liturgy and a healing regime supported by the sacraments, relics, devotional imagery, and music. So healing and ideas about medicine were very much bound up with religious life. The infirmary itself was provided with a chapel or high altar at which daily masses were performed, and patients' beds were placed so that they could witness the moment of the transubstantiation, when the Eucharistic wafer was transformed miraculously into the body of Christ. And this, the Eucharist, was regarded as the most efficacious medicine for medieval Christians. Medieval monasteries also had access to Greek medical texts, newly translated in the early 12th century from Islamic to Latin. Medicine became more abstract and academic in the 12th century, a more theoretical approach that broke with an earlier empirical tradition. The approach was hugely influenced by the Greek physician Galen. Medieval medical theory was based on the idea of the 4 humours of the body interacting with the 4 natural elements. The human body was believed to be made up of 4 natural elements which also made up the universe: fire, water, earth, and air. The disciplined life of the medieval monastery was an ideal fit with the medical concept of the regimen sanitatis, the proper management of the body to achieve an equilibrium based on diet and moderation. For medieval monastics, this included an emphasis on sanitation, fresh water, personal hygiene, and the balancing of the humours through phlebotomy, bloodletting. On average, each monk was bled every 6 to 7 weeks, which is quite remarkable, followed by 3 days recuperation in the infirmary, where they would have been allowed to relax and have a meat-enriched diet to recuperate. The division between academic and empirical approaches in medieval medicine was strengthened by a statement in the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which prohibited all clergy in higher orders from performing medical procedures involving bloodshed in case they were to accidentally murder their patient. Monasteries therefore employed laymen such as barber surgeons to perform surgery and phlebotomy. So a monastic monk infirmary should not have been performing surgery and would have brought someone else in to do that for them. Historical sources suggest that the boom in English hospital foundations was in the 12th century, while the height of hospital foundation in Scotland appears to have been in the 15th century. That's at least if you take your starting point as historical texts. The dates of hospital foundations are based on the earliest surviving documentary references, but it's quite possible that Scottish hospitals recorded in the 15th century had been in existence for some time, and that's possibly one of the first questions I would want to ask about medieval Scottish hospitals. This is particularly because recent research on English hospitals has really challenged the prevailing models for the chronology of hospital foundation. Excavations at 3 medieval hospitals in England have identified specialist cemeteries predating the foundation of the monasteries and predating the Norman conquest, suggesting that some medieval hospitals may have prehistories as Anglo-Saxon healing sites. These include the leper hospital of St. Mary Magdalene in Winchester, the Hospital of St. Mary Magdalene in Putney in Lincolnshire, and St. Mary's Spital in London. So the question is, were these medieval hospitals established at locales already esteemed as therapeutic landscapes, places with enduring reputations for providing physical, spiritual, and mental healing? In Scotland, some hospitals may have been associated with earlier healing wells. There were healing wells and springs located all over, as many as 600 in the later Middle Ages, and some of those in the Highlands remained associated with healing rites up to the modern period. Those of you who were here last night know I talked about St. Fillan's Well in the southeast Highlands and Loch Marie in the northwest, both connected with folk cures for insanity, involving immersion and ritual practice. But both places are associated with Celtic saints and the remains of early medieval archaeology, perhaps suggesting a very long-standing reputation as therapeutic landscapes, stretching from the early medieval period right up to the modern day. The Isle of May is a strong candidate for a Celtic healing shrine that continued in therapeutic use for over 1,000 years. The Cluniac monastic cell at May represents a relatively short episode in the history of the island, founded in the 12th century and abandoned in the 13th. Skeletons excavated from the cemetery date from the 5th to the late 16th century, confirming that the island was a pilgrimage centre for a much longer period. The important thing is that it was not documented as such, but the archaeology is actually giving us insight to this much longer tradition. 58 articulated skeletons were excavated, representing only around 20% of the total cemetery area. Most of the cemetery seems to have been in use during the earlier period of May's occupation, spanning from the 5th to the mid-12th century and predating the foundation of the monastery. So the skeletal analysis refers to this earlier period. Analysis by Marlowe Willows has shown that the skeletal population was striking in 3 respects. First, they were predominantly male, 94% of sexed burials. Secondly, almost all of them showed at least one pathological lesion, which is also highly unusual in comparison with other sites. And thirdly, there was a high proportion of young adults, aged under 25 years of age. The predominance of males suggests either a male religious community or could indicate that only part of the cemetery was excavated and that they were practicing segregation in burial. But the extremely high presence of disease among young adults may suggest something distinctive at May, perhaps a cult site that attracted infirm young men, both lay and religious pilgrims in search of a cure. I want to go on now to talk about the archaeology of medieval healing and how archaeology can make a potential contribution to the history of medicine. But care is needed in how we define the framework for analysis. Archaeological insight to the more academic, theoretical constructs of medieval medicine may be limited, but material sources provide new perspectives on the broader empirical tradition delivered by a diverse range of practitioners. This includes physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, herbalists, lay sisters, bone setters, and midwives. The archaeology of medieval healing, as I define it, focuses on the full spectrum of healing practices, from managing the body to prevent illness, through to treatment of the sick, and even preparing the corpse for burial. The most obvious source may be skeletal evidence, providing insight to disease, disability, and care for the sick. My particular focus here is on the evidence for direct medical intervention. For example, at the Augustinian Priory of St. Mary Merton, 13% of the skeletal population of 664 individuals showed evidence of well-healed fractures, most of which were well aligned. This suggests some degree of medical care, perhaps from bone setters or barber surgeons, not necessarily by monastic infirmers. In Scotland, well-healed fractures were recorded in skeletons excavated from the Carmelite friaries of Aberdeen, Perth and Linlithgow, and more recently from Cistercian Newbattle Abbey. The most well-excavated and studied medieval hospital cemetery is that of the Augustinian Hospital of St. Mary's Spital in London, where 10,500 skeletons have been analysed. There were 550 cases of fractured long bones, most of which showed some, half of which showed some deformity in healing, and around 8.5% to 10% failed to heal at all. So there's a variety of treatment and intervention. There were also 5 cases of surgery at St. Mary's Spital, 2 amputations and 3 trepanations in which a piece of the cranium is cut and removed. It's likely in all of these cases of trepanation that the surgery was intended to treat a head wound, for example, to remove splinters of bone or to release pressure after a head injury. Surgical intervention of this type was extremely rare, with only 5 cases of trepanation in medieval Britain recorded, including the later medieval phase at Whithorn. Cases of lower limb amputation have been identified in skeletons excavated from leper hospitals at Winchester and Chichester, indicating that surgical intervention in advanced cases of leprosy was required. These examples are important because they provide a new archaeological insight to treatment in medieval hospitals, whereas historical sources seem to indicate that this kind of direct medical intervention was not going on. Diet was an important component of the monastic regimen and hospital care. In theory, the later medieval monastic diet was based around the staples of bread, cheese, vegetables, beans, and cereals, with smaller quantities of eggs, fish, and meat. The rule of St. Benedict forbade the consumption of meat, but the monastic infirmary, because of the kind of phlebotomy, the bloodletting that was going on, allowed them to have a more meat-enriched diet. It was generally provided with its own kitchen and would have been provided with a special diet for any monks who were either ill or had been through bloodletting. The study of the archaeological evidence for the kind of diet that they would have been receiving is slightly problematic because the waste disposal practices at monasteries were so good. They were so scrupulous about disposing of waste by medieval standards. It's rarely possible to identify food remains from specific areas. But food waste was recovered from the infirmary kitchen excavated at St. Mary Merton from floors and associated pits. And this gives us a good idea of the kind of diet they would have been consuming. There were chicken bones in very large quantities, so the kind of classic chicken soup is obviously a long-standing treatment for illness, alongside cattle, sheep and pig with a few fragments of goose, duck and game birds, and a very substantial and diverse assemblage of fish bones with major components including herring, carp and cod. Archaeobotanical evidence has potential for discerning medical treatment in monasteries and hospitals, but care is needed in interpretation. For example, plant macrofossils may indicate evidence for foodstuffs or seasonings, although the boundary was blurred in medieval practice, so foods such as garlic, onions, honey and almonds were considered to be medicinal. Plants generally perceived by us as ornamental may also have been seen as therapeutic, such as rose, violet, and mint. And this is because smells were regarded as material substances in vapor form, so that when inhaled, they were believed to act on the heart and brain and could help to rebalance the humours. Plants and herbs were used in a variety of substances like ointments, laxatives, purges, and sedatives, with properties and applications recorded in early herbals such as mesas, gerards, and culpepers dating to the 14th, 16th, and 17th centuries respectively. At Merton Priory, exceptionally large quantities of black mustard seeds were recovered from the infirmary area, which was recommended in Culpepper's herbal for treatments of coughs, toothaches, or throat swellings. Both Merton and St. Mary Spital produce seeds of henbane, a powerful sedative, but also a common local species that could have been intrusive in the assemblage. Henbane and celandine have also been found at the Isle of May and in the drain at Paisley Abbey. Paisley also produced a variety of plants with possible medicinal uses, such as hemlock, which can be used as a strong sedative, and caper spurge, well known as a purgative. Opium poppy was also present at Paisley and has been reported from Sutra as an organic residue adhering to a jar. The monastic regimen placed emphasis on the holistic prevention of illness through the regulation of diet, physical activity, and the practice of bloodletting. Preventative measures also included care of the body through personal grooming and hygiene, such as the use of ear scoops and toothpicks. For example, excavations at Dunfermline recovered a bone ear scoop and an elaborate combination tool of tweezers and ear scoop in copper alloy. Tweezers were common tools for personal grooming, but they could also be used for medical depilation or surgery. And small numbers of grooming tools are recovered very regularly from monastic sites, including the ear scoops and picks, etc. And most interestingly, from the Benedictine Priory of St. James, Bristol, a number of bone objects were interpreted as toothbrushes with rows of holes to take the bristles. Monastic hospitals and infirmary buildings are the most direct form of archaeological evidence for medieval healing, providing the spatial context for nursing the sick. The infirmary housed elderly and infirm monks and those recuperating from illness, injury, and the regular round of bloodletting. The well-documented case of Norwich Cathedral Priory reveals that 30% of the monks would have passed through the infirmary in any single year. And the Norwich Infirmary records confirm that it was staffed by 4 to 5 attendants, including a keeper of the sick, a servant of those who had been bled, a laundress, a boy, and a clerk of the chapel. A full-time phlebotomist was employed from the 14th century, and local surgeons were occasionally brought in, together with physicians trained in the Galenic tradition. The infirmary complex was usually sited to the east of the cloister for practical, medical, and spiritual motives, but location was determined primarily by the needs for clean water. It was usual for the monastery's watercourse to pass first through the infirmary in order to provide the purest water to this area. And this was not necessarily because of any understanding of ideas of contagion, but because water was connected with healing through the sacrament of baptism, bringing together the connotations of physical and spiritual cleansing and recalling Christ's baptism by John the Baptist in the River Jordan. According to medieval notions of contagion, infections were transported by mists and noxious smells caused by stagnant water or sewage and absorbed into the body through pores. The siting of monastic infirmaries to the east of the cloister stems also from this understanding of contagion, following the Hippocratic notion that the healthiest location was in the east. The scale and complexity of the infirmary depended on the size and wealth of the monastic foundation. A larger abbey or cathedral priory was often provided with a second cloister dedicated exclusively to the infirmary, around which were arranged the infirmary hall and chapel and specialist facilities. These could be quite elaborate. They would include a kitchen to prepare the meat-enriched diet, a dining room reserved for meat consumption, private chambers, a bloodletting room, a latrine block, and possibly even a bathhouse, as at Ely and Canterbury cathedrals. The monks of Norwich complained about the lack of tubs and other facilities for bathing and shaving, but they did benefit from a specialist pharmacy for the infirmary to prepare medications from exotic ingredients listed in the account rolls. I thought you might find it interesting to hear these. They range from the familiar to the fantastic, but all of them are fairly surprising in a medieval context. They run ginger, cinnamon, peony, licorice, fennel, rice, cloves, mace, cassia, aniseed, white turmeric, poppy seeds, prunes, nutmeg, frankincense, and dragon's blood, all of which I'm sure you can get locally. So, relatively few monastic infirmaries have been excavated, and the investigations that have taken place have focused on the infirmary hall rather than ancillary buildings. At KELSO Abbey in the Scottish borders, the infirmary hall was excavated to the southeast of the main cloister. The central space and eastern aisle were located, showing an arrangement of alternating circular and octagonal piers, very like the example of Norwich that we've just seen. KELSO's infirmary was aligned north-south rather than the more typical east-west, a pattern also seen at Waltham, Fountains and Rievaulx Abbey, so it is well known. An impressive assemblage of cooking pots and jugs was recorded, some of which you can see in the museum here. And these were confirmed by petrological analysis to have been made from local clays. The importance of lighting is illustrated by the find of a green glazed cresset lamp, rare in Scotland, but this idea of lighting was really very important in infirmary halls. The infirmary complex at Merton Priory is a good example, perhaps one of the best excavated monastic infirmaries. It developed to the southeast of the cloister with a separate infirmary cloister created between the monastic east range and the infirmary hall. A large latrine block was shared by the infirmary and the monks' dormitory. A chapel and kitchen abutted the infirmary hall. And the typical arrangement for the infirmary hall is shown here with an aisled space opening into a chapel at the eastern end. I think you can just see the chapel up there. The beds of the patients were located in the aisles of the hall, with the central space kept clear for the circulation of nursing staff. That arrangement has always been assumed on the basis of manuscript illuminations, but it's been confirmed now by archaeological evidence of wear patterns in the floors of infirmary halls. At St. Mary's Spital, the central area of the earth floor was eroded. At Merton, the floor tiles were more heavily worn in the centre of the hall. The chapel may have been screened from the hall, but direct visual access to the altar was important for the inmates to benefit from the healing power of the Eucharist, which I mentioned before. Merton suggests that the standards of living were quite high within the hall. There were fireplaces provided and glazed windows, and there was also a possible cupboard in the western wall interpreted as a dispensary for medicines. In the later Middle Ages, monastic infirmary halls were often modified to create more private spaces for inmates and special dining rooms where the meat-enriched diet was served. These private chambers were created by subdividing the aisles of the infirmary hall into separate chambers, and at Merton that happened in the 14th century by creating private rooms within the aisles. Arrangements in an Augustinian hospital priory are well illustrated by St. Mary's Spital in London. So in contrast with Merton, where we were looking at a monastic infirmary within an Augustinian priory, this is an actual hospital priory. So the hospital function is the main reason for its foundation. And the well-excavated example of St. Mary's Spital shows both expansion over time and the accommodation of separate social groups within the community. It's typical in that it was located on the edge of town, as many hospitals are, near the walls and on main roads in order to cater for pilgrims. St. Mary's Spital was founded to care for pilgrims, sick poor, orphans, and women in childbirth. The foundation of 1197, the first recorded, was for a small hospital of just 12 to 13 beds arranged in a simple rectangular hall. The refoundation of the hospital in 1235 increased the number of beds to 60. Both men and women were accepted in the hospital, and they were segregated by keeping them in separate parts of this T-shaped hall, with the chapel in the centre and men and women housed in separate arms, the cross. This T-shape was a kind of standard method of sexual segregation used at other hospitals such as St. John the Baptist in Canterbury. In terms of the material culture, one of the interesting things from St. Mary's Spital are the assemblages of keys, which have also come up at hospitals such as St. Bartholomew, Bristol. And it's been suggested that these may have been for lockers in the hospital, for inmates to keep their personal, patients to keep their personal belongings while they were staying in the hospital. St. Mary's Spital was rebuilt again around 1280 into a large two-storey infirmary, and the earlier hall, the T-shape here, was converted into a church. And it's likely that men and women at that point were segregated on different floors. So at the height of its development in the 14th century, the hospital catered for 180 beds. The patients were cared for by a nursing staff of 6 to 7 lay sisters who were accommodated in a house next to the infirmary, built initially in timber and rebuilt in stone in the late 14th century. This housed the sisters' dormitory and refectory. They also had their own private garden, and the archaeological finds from the area include thimbles and bone needles that the sisters would have used in mending, and personal dress accessories including buckles, finger rings, and possible headdress pins. Each lay sister would have nursed up to 30 beds at St. Mary's Spital, with perhaps 2 to 3 patients in each one, a ratio of 1 nurse for up to 60 or 70 patients. I won't make any comments about the National Health Service, as tempting as it is at this point. These women nursed the sick and carried out daily chores. The main roles were around preparing meals for the sick, keeping the lamps lit in the infirmary, that's where the lighting comes in, and changing and laundering the bed sheets. Nursing sisters took the customary monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and were expected to dress in the most humble attire. In fact, hospital ordinances frequently specified that nursing sisters must be virgins, chaste widows, or women over the age of 50 who should be selected for nursing sisters. They greeted and washed new inmates when they arrived at the hospital, and washed and prepared the dead for burial in the hospital cemetery. And it's important to understand that nursing was seen as an active spiritual vocation for women, a kind of parallel with the nuns who I was talking about in the previous lecture. But by the later Middle Ages, salaried nursing servants were beginning to replace these monastic nursing sisters. In terms of the nurses of St. Mary's Spital, it's interesting to compare the kind of modest accommodation that they had with that provided by the canons, the male religious of St. Mary's Spital. They were provided with a full monastic cloister to the north of the church, complete with dormitory, refectory, chapter house, private kitchen, infirmary, etc. So a full monastery. The difference in the status between the sisters and the canons is all too evident. It's not just a reflection on gender relations, but also the greater value placed on the spiritual administrations of the canons over the practical care for the body that was provided by the nursing sisters. The monks, or the canons, praying for the souls of the patients was regarded as more likely to help them than the physical administration of the nurses, providing the clean sheets and the better food and the administration generally. Archaeology provides insight to the diagnosis and treatment of the sick in monastic infirmaries and hospitals. This practice of more academic medicine is confirmed by fragments of urinals or Jordans, the common symbol of the medieval physician. Physicians used urinals, usually made from glass, to examine urine samples for consistency, colour, clarity, and odour, which signified particular diseases or states of health. This was the main approach to treating disease. Uroscopy was the mainstay of the physician's diagnostic repertoire, and the technique was closely associated with astrology, which influenced the diagnosis and the recommended cure. The extensive excavations at St. Mary's Spital, as I've talked about, turned up only 2 fragments of glass urinal dated to the 14th century, perhaps suggesting that this kind of more academic medicine was not widely practiced within a monastic hospital. They are more common within monastic infirmaries, such as St. Mary Merton and also Battle Abbey. Scotland provides a slightly different picture on this, in that only ceramic urinals have been reported, to my knowledge, including a complete example from the Great Drain at Paisley, 1 from Coldingham, and 3 from Glenluce. Some years ago, Stephen Moorhouse suggested that ceramic urinals were not intended for medical purposes, but were instead used to separate liquid and solid human waste, with urine retained for industrial uses such as tanning. He notes the concentration of such vessels near latrine blocks at Melrose Abbey and Kirkstall Abbey, and explains them as accidental losses when emptying waste. However, the complete absence of glass urinals in Scotland suggests that these ceramic vessels must have been used for uroscopy if any medical diagnosis was going on. Vessel glass is rarely recovered from Scottish medieval contexts, and there's no evidence for the manufacture of glass in Scotland until much later. Medieval burials sometimes provide evidence of therapeutic devices that would have been used in medieval monasteries and hospitals. Now, these are great rarities, I should stress. The great majority of Christian burials were simple interments of the naked corpse in the shroud, with no clothing or grave goods included. But very rarely, healing objects were left in place on the corpse after it had been washed and prepared for burial. Two main types of therapeutic object have been identified in burial contexts: copper alloy plates used to protect and heal joint injuries, and hernia trusses. So examples of both of these are shown here. The pairs of support plates have been found in places like the Gilbertine Priory in York, and also the Leper Hospital in Reading. And the female from Reading, which was the female skeleton that was found with these, had a badly necrosed humerus, so this was quite a bad injury. And the plates contained organic material, possibly dock leaves, applied as a poultice to the infection. Also examples from St. Mary Spital and St. Mary Merton, where they had the same pattern of organic material adhering to the plates. And these burials range from the 12th to the 14th centuries. The hernia truss is a remarkable example here from Merton again. Hernia trusses are known from early medieval graves in Britain and Europe, but just one example has been identified from a later medieval monastic cemetery in Britain. This is associated with an older male skeleton in the north transept of the church at Merton Priory, found with the belt in situ, worn low on the pelvis and interpreted as a support for a scrotal hernia. And this man obviously wasn't letting go in death either. He's taking this with him. The Merton belt is made from iron and was bound to the body with woven textile and fixed with buckles. Both hands of the skeleton were clutching the strap, with some of the fingers laced over the belt and some behind it. Specialist surgical instruments are sometimes found, but these are remarkably rare in Britain. I've searched quite hard for this lecture. There are no confirmed examples from monastic sites in the UK, although there are two bronze objects from Glen Luce that may be surgical hooks. We can also perhaps include general purpose objects such as scissors and knives, which may have been used for medical use. For instance, 34 knives and blade fragments were excavated from the Hospital of St. Giles by Brompton Bridge in North Yorkshire. These might have been employed for medical purposes such as phlebotomy, preparing medicinal ingredients, and cutting up dressings. But on the other hand, they could equally well have been used for domestic and craft working activities. Now, what's so interesting to me is that the paucity of specialist instruments from Britain can be contrasted with recently excavated sites elsewhere in Northern Europe. For example, the site of SKRIÐUKLAUSTUR, a remote Icelandic hospital and monastery following the Augustinian rule. Excavations by Steinen Christian's daughter recently have found evidence from medical care and implements for surgery or suturing, together with medical files. Similarly, in Sweden, the Cistercian monasteries of Älvstra and Varnum produced a large range of medical objects, including scalpels, phlebotomy knives, a cautery, a surgical hook, spatulas for applying medicaments, probes and forceps for exploring wounds, and curettes for cleaning wounds. So great assemblage of specialist medical material. The negative archaeological evidence from Britain seems to confirm that surgery was not routinely practiced in monastic hospitals and infirmaries. It must have been carried out elsewhere by barber surgeons operating on other premises. But there is growing archaeological evidence for other types of medical intervention, such as the use of herbal medicine in the treatment of the sick. So, for example, we have the albarellos, or drug jars, identified at a number of monastic sites. These are specialist vessels imported from the Mediterranean containing exotic drugs from the dispensary. Possible examples have been reported from the Carmelite Friary in Linlithgow, from Merton Priory, and a near-complete example from the nunnery of St. Mary Clerkenwell, dated to the second quarter of the 16th century. Herbal plants were also grown in monastic gardens and collected from the local environment to be processed for medicinal use. Monastic account rolls sometimes confirm the purchase of distilling equipment to transform herbs and flowers into scented oils, essences, and waters. For example, the infirmary of Norwich Cathedral Priory recorded the regular purchase of glass phials and distillation equipment in the 15th century, in addition to the purchase of a large alembic and the construction of a clay furnace to be fired by peat. But there's also extensive archaeological evidence for distillation equipment at English monasteries, comprising ceramic alembics, which are the still heads, and glass cucurbits, distilling bases on which the alembic sat, and ceramic or glass flasks and phials that served as receivers for the distillate. There's a good example of a later glass one in the museum just outside. A liquid was boiled in the lower vessel, the cucurbit, and the vapor condensed in the dome head of the upper vessel, the alembic, and the resulting liquid drained through a collecting channel into the receiver so that you get your distillate there. The largest assembly of glass and associated ceramics for distilling comes from Pontefract Priory, with significant concentrations recovered from Selborne Abbey, Kirkstall Abbey, and St. Mary's Spittal. Now, some of these sites have yielded only ceramic examples, such as the relatively poor site of Cistercian Halton Abbey, whereas others have produced rich evidence for pharmaceutical glass, such as St. James, Bristol. Many monastic and secular sites have produced one or more of these fragments, confirming the widespread practice of distilling from the 14th century onwards. I know of 3 ceramic alembics from medieval Scotland, but I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm missing some, including one from Jedburgh Abbey and one from Aberdeen Franciscan Friary, a recent find. ICP analysis has confirmed that this is a local Scottish redware manufactured in the Perth area. And there's also a fragment from the leper hospital of St. Nicholas in St. Andrews, which I think is the first evidence of distillation at a leprosarium. So what were they producing in this sort of equipment, this specialist equipment? Well, residue analysis on an alembic from Merton Priory suggested the distillation of a fermented product. This might have been wine turned into aqua vitae, for example, which had a range of medical uses which they believed in the medieval period could cure toothache, expel poison, and even treat cancer. But what I found interesting in reading about this is that not all of these distillations produced inert herbal liqueurs. Excavations at St. Mary's Spittal have produced evidence for 3 discrete areas of distilling, each of which employed heavy metals, such as lead. A cucurbit with a rich lead residue came from an early 14th century deposit in the canon's infirmary. Slightly later in the 14th century, a specialist pharmacy was built to the east of the canon's infirmary. This had a timber frame building with a series of hearths with peat burnings, hearth covering the floor, a common industrial method used by distillers. And residual evidence of arsenic, lead, copper, and iron was found in the building and in the glass and ceramic distilling vessels excavated from a pit nearby. So these also included calcium and phosphorus, possibly from crushed bone. So these materials are not simply being produced into aqua vitae. Are they actually medicines at all? Well, distillation was also employed for the production of artist pigments, which could have been going on within a monastery, and these would have contained lead and arsenic. The same equipment could have been used to make nitric acid for use in assaying to test the quality of silver and gold, and also for alchemical experiments that aim to transform one substance into another. But the same metals and minerals were combined with herbs in medieval recipes. For example, a 15th century medical recipe for distilled water combined the following ingredients: filings of gold, silver, copper, iron, and lead, together with calamine, myrrh, gum, aloes, azalea, and the urine of a virginal young boy. It was used to treat eye problems and leprosy, and was also reputed to preserve youth. We know that mercury was used to treat skin diseases such as scabies, and was employed to treat skin lesions associated with leprosy and syphilis. Mineral materials such as arsenic, sulfur, and gypsum, lead, and iron were commonly used in the classical and medieval pharmacopoeia for treating diseases of the skin, eyes, and sexual organs. Now, the prevailing view of medieval medical historians that I began with is that medieval hospitals provided just warmth, rest, basic nursing care, and nourishing food. Treatment within the monastic infirmary was more closely informed by academic medicine, revolving around a routine of uroscopy, astrology, and bloodletting to achieve a balance of humours in each individual monk. The medical historian Peregrine Horden stresses that medieval medicine emphasised rhetoric over practice or intervention. Prevention and talking cures were valued over technological intervention, in contrast with modern biomedicine. And yet, when the archaeological data are drawn together, there is considerable evidence for monastic healing, some of which was based around active, we might even say technological intervention. In summary, the main classes of archaeological evidence for medieval healing are excavated infirmary complexes, potential medical objects from infirmary and cemetery contexts, archaeobotanical evidence for herbal medicine, preventative measures including diet, hygiene, and care of the body, and skeletal evidence for medical intervention such as bone setting, amputation, and trepanation. Each of these classes of evidence must be critically assessed according to their social and archaeological context. What do they tell us about differences in treatment between hospitals and monastic infirmaries? Do they offer any commentary on the experience of patients or who was responsible for treating them? And can we detect regional differences or traditions in monastic healing? Well, a significant difference is that monastic infirmaries were masculine environments with care for the sick undertaken by the monk infirmary and male servants. The well-documented case of Norwich Cathedral Priory confirms that the only female servant was the laundress. She provided a supply of clean sheets, but it's unlikely to have interacted with monastic patients. They did at least include her on a carved boss in the cloister. In contrast, nursing in hospital infirmaries was undertaken by lay sisters who had taken monastic vows, gradually replaced in the later Middle Ages by female nursing servants. Both environments yield significant archaeobotanical evidence for the use of herbal medicine in treating the sick. The medical historian Carol Rawcliffe suggests that it was medieval women who were doing this work and that they were skillful herbalists. She suggests that the sisters' garden at hospitals such as St. Giles in Norwich were used to grow medicinal herbs, and that nursing sisters drew on the empirical tradition of herbal medicine to treat hospital patients, and that it may also have been them who was doing things like bone setting. The evidence of amputation and trepanation from burial contexts confirms that surgeons were called upon to treat more acute cases. Only 2 fragments of glass urinal were recovered from the extensive excavations at St. Mary's Spittal, perhaps confirming that the more academic approaches to medieval medical diagnosis were employed only very rarely in hospitals. Urinals are commonly recovered from monastic sites, confirming the widespread importance of uroscopy in the monastic regimen, although perhaps limited in Scotland by the absence of these glass vessels. Therapeutic devices seem to be more closely associated with monastic than hospital care, although healing plates were found at the leper hospital at Reading. So clearly there was an overlap in practice between the 2 types of institution, despite the gender difference in the nursing personnel. But monastic infirmaries seem to have been more likely to import exotic drugs for the dispensary on the basis of drug jars identified from archaeological context to date. The clearest indication of medical intervention is through the production of pharmaceuticals, demonstrated by the extensive evidence for glass and ceramic equipment for distillation. Residue analysis at St. Mary's Spittal confirms the use of heavy metals in distillations, including mercury, lead, iron, arsenic, and copper. It's possible that distilling was carried out in connection with more industrial processes, such as assaying, but the spatial context suggests a medical function. And this can be compared with the large assemblages of distilling equipment recovered from Pontefract Friary and Selborne Abbey decades ago. These were concentrated near the monastic latrine blocks in close proximity to the monks' dormitories. Now, it's extremely unlikely that these manufacturing processes would have been located in such close proximity to the sacred space of the church and cloister and in direct contact with the main water source. Very early in the lecture, I stressed the importance of the purity of that water source and how that was protected. Monastic infirmaries were generally sited precisely in this area, close to the dormitory and the main drain. The medical application of these distilling compounds is confirmed by historical and skeletal evidence that heavy metals such as mercury were used to treat leprosy and syphilis. So were the hospital inmates at St. Mary's Spital being treated with medicines produced at pharmacies within the precinct? The location of the distilleries is central to this question. Two of the possible pharmacy production areas are in close proximity to the canon's dormitory and infirmary, rather than sited within the infirmary of the sick poor. The spatial evidence may suggest that distilled medicines may have been reserved for the treatment of the canons, those chaps that got the fantastic cloister and accommodation, rather than for the sick poor. Finally, it is worth stressing the apparent regional differences in the degree of medical intervention that took place in monastic and hospital infirmaries in different parts of Europe. Archaeological excavation of Icelandic and Swedish monasteries has yielded far more material culture for surgery and medical treatment. Future research on monastic healing should consider regional differences, but also reflect on the relationship of monastic healing to earlier traditions and therapeutic landscapes. Can it really be the case that Scottish hospitals were not founded until the 15th century? What was going on earlier at these sites? Were the locations of hospitals selected to harness the healing qualities of earlier therapeutic landscapes? To address this question requires holistic study of the network of holy wells, shrines, hospitals and monasteries that made up the landscape of medieval healing. Thank you.